Miss Juliet, I need to win back the love of my life, and you're going to pretend to be my girlfriend to make her jealous, because frankly, you're exactly the kind of desperate nobody she'll believe could fall for a man like me." Juliet Summers felt the blood drain from her face as she stared across the imposing mahogany desk at Thomas Blackwell. The tech billionaire delivered his crushing words with the same casual indifference he might use to order his morning espresso, his piercing blue eyes studying her reaction like a scientist observing a lab rat. The crystal paperweight in her trembling hands, a small gift she'd brought hoping to make a good impression, suddenly felt impossibly heavy. She'd walked into Blackwell Enterprises believing she was interviewing for a simple receptionist position, not to be verbally eviscerated by Seattle's most ruthless CEO. "I'm sorry, what?" Juliet's voice cracked, though she fought to keep her composure. The morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows seemed to mock her, illuminating every expensive detail of his corner office. The abstract paintings worth more than her rent, the Italian leather furniture, the panoramic view of Elliott Bay that stretched beyond the glass like a postcard of a life she'd never touch. Thomas leaned forward in his custom chair, his Armani suit fitting his broad frame like it was sewn onto him. At 32, he possessed the kind of devastating good looks that graced magazine covers: sharp jawline, thick dark hair, and those calculating eyes that seemed to strip away every defense she'd ever built. "Let me paint you a clearer picture, Miss Summers." He slid a tablet across the polished desk, revealing photos of a stunning redhead dripping in diamonds and designer gowns. "This is Isabella Ashworth, supermodel, socialite, and the woman who walked out of my life 6 months ago because she claimed I was emotionally unavailable and incapable of genuine love." Juliet's stomach twisted as she stared at the images. Isabella at charity galas, fashion weeks, yachts in Monaco. Even through a screen, the woman radiated the kind of effortless sophistication that Juliet could never achieve with her discount store wardrobe and drugstore makeup. "She needs to see me with someone." Thomas paused, his gaze raking over Juliet's simple navy dress and worn flats, with obvious distaste. "Someone utterly authentic. Someone whose very presence would convince her that I've miraculously developed the capacity for selfless love." The cruel implication hit Juliet like a physical blow. "You want me to be your fake girlfriend because I'm so ordinary that she'll believe you must really care about me?" "Precisely." His smile could have cut glass. "Isabella believes in fairy tales, transformation, the power of pure hearts to change beasts. She needs to witness me with someone genuinely good. Someone so fundamentally different from my usual arm candy that she'll assume I've found my soul." Juliet's hands clenched in her lap, her grandmother's engagement ring, the only valuable thing she owned, digging into her palm. "And what makes you think I'm that pathetic?" Thomas opened a leather portfolio with theatrical precision. "Juliet Marie Summers, 25, works nights cleaning office buildings and weekends at a flower market. Graduated with honors in English literature, but buried her dreams of becoming a teacher to care for her disabled younger brother." His voice was clinically detached, as if reading stock reports. "Lives in a studio apartment in Ballard, drives a 12-year-old Civic held together with prayer and duct tape, and just had her electricity shut off for the 2nd time this year." Each word was a dagger to her pride. Juliet felt her cheeks burn with humiliation as her carefully constructed dignity crumbled. "How dare you! Your brother Danny needs surgery for his spinal condition," Thomas continued ruthlessly. "The operation costs $300,000. Your insurance was canceled last month due to non-payment, and the medical debt collectors are already circling." He leaned back, supremely confident in his cruelty. "Tell me, Miss Summers, how long can you keep pretending everything's fine while your brother suffers?" The question hung in the air like poison gas. Juliet's vision blurred as tears threatened to spill, but she refused to give him the satisfaction. Outside, Seattle's morning rush continued. People with normal problems, normal choices, normal lives where billionaires didn't dissect your failures like a science experiment. "You investigated my entire life just to humiliate me," she whispered. "I investigated you because I needed to ensure you were perfect for the role." Thomas's tone remained maddeningly calm. 6 months, Miss Summers. Pretend to be madly in love with me. Convince Isabella that I've changed. And when she comes back, which she will, you disappear with enough money to save your brother and start whatever little life you've been dreaming of. Juliet stood on shaking legs, her worn purse clutched against her chest like armor. I may be poor, Mr. Blackwell, but I'm not for sale. $500,000. The number stopped her cold. Juliet's breath caught as the full weight of the offer crashed over her. Danny's surgery, a real apartment, maybe even enough left over to return to school, to reclaim the teaching dreams she'd buried under years of survival. Plus, Thomas added with predatory precision, I'll cover all your brother's medical expenses during the arrangement. Physical therapy, medications, the works. He tilted his head, studying her like a chess master contemplating his final move. Unless, of course, your pride is worth more than his ability to walk. The cruelty of the choice stole her breath. Juliet closed her eyes, seeing Danny's face from that morning, 19 years old and trying so hard to hide his pain, joking about being her favorite burden while she helped him into his wheelchair. She thought of the surgery consultation they couldn't afford, the hope dying a little more in his eyes each day. If I agreed, she forced out, hating herself for even considering it. What exactly would this arrangement entail? Thomas's smile was sharp as winter steel. Welcome to the performance of a lifetime, Miss Summers. Try not to disappoint me. The words echoed in the vast office as Juliet realized she'd already lost the game before she'd even known she was playing it. Sign here and remember, one tear, one genuine emotion, one moment where you forget this is all pretend, and I'll destroy what's left of your pathetic little life. Juliet's hand trembled as she stared at the contract Thomas had slid across his desk. The legal document was thicker than her college textbooks, filled with clauses that made her stomach churn. 3 days had passed since his devastating proposal. 3 sleepless nights of watching Danny try to hide his pain while she wrestled with the devil's bargain. Clause 15 is my personal favorite, Thomas said, his voice dripping with cruel amusement as he leaned back in his leather chair. Should you develop any inconvenient feelings during our arrangement, the contract becomes null and void. You walk away with nothing. The morning Seattle rain pelted against the floor-to-ceiling windows like bullets, matching the storm brewing in Juliet's chest. She'd spent the weekend researching Thomas Blackwell, tech prodigy who'd built his empire by crushing competitors, a man who collected companies the way other people collected stamps. The tabloids called him the Heartbreak Prince, notorious for dating supermodels for exactly 3 months before discarding them like yesterday's fashion. And Clause 23? Juliet forced herself to read aloud, her voice barely above a whisper. The party of the second part agrees to complete physical transformation under the direction of approved stylists, with all clothing, accessories, and appearance modifications remaining property of Blackwell Enterprises upon contract termination. Think of it as playing dress up, Thomas replied with mock gentleness. We can't have Isabella thinking I've lowered my standards too dramatically. You'll need to look presentable. Each word was a calculated humiliation. Juliet's fingers traced the signature line, remembering Danny's voice from that morning. Jules, maybe you should take that office job. I heard you crying last night, and I can't stand knowing I'm the reason you're drowning. There's something else. Thomas opened his laptop, angling the screen toward her. Isabella's engagement party. Tomorrow night at the Fairmont Olympic. She's marrying Richard Ashworth III. Old money, polo ponies, the whole aristocratic package. The engagement photos on his screen were like a knife to the chest. Isabella radiated happiness in her fiancé's arms, her smile genuine in a way Juliet had never seen in the earlier photos. Richard was classically handsome with kind eyes. Everything Thomas wasn't. She looks... Juliet paused, surprised by the sudden tightness in her throat. She looks happy. Something dark flickered across Thomas's face before the mask slipped back into place. Happiness is temporary. Love is a business transaction. She'll realize that soon enough. What if she doesn't? The question escaped before Juliet could stop it. What if she actually loves him? Thomas's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. Then I'll make sure she remembers what she gave up. He closed the laptop with a decisive snap. But first, we need to make our debut. The engagement party will be perfect. Isabella will see us together, realize what she's missing, and the countdown to her return begins. Juliet stared at the contract, her mind reeling. Tomorrow night she'd be thrust into a world of champagne and caviar, surrounded by Seattle's elite, while pretending to be madly in love with a man who saw her as nothing more than a prop in his twisted game. I need guarantees about Danny's surgery, she said, surprising herself with the steadiness of her voice. Full payment up front to Seattle Children's Hospital, non-refundable, regardless of how this arrangement ends. Thomas raised an eyebrow, the first sign of genuine interest he'd shown. Making demands now, are we? I'm protecting my brother. Juliet lifted her chin, meeting his gaze despite the tremor in her hands. You've made it clear this is a business transaction. I want my terms in writing. For a moment, the office fell silent, except for the rain's relentless drumming. Thomas studied her with those calculating blue eyes, and Juliet fought the urge to squirm under his scrutiny. She'd seen sharks at the aquarium with warmer expressions. Fine. He pressed a button on his phone. Harrison, add an addendum to the Summers contract. Full payment for the brothers' medical expenses, transferred immediately upon signing. Make it legally binding. The efficient voice of his assistant crackled through the speaker. Certainly, Mr. Blackwell. Should I also arrange for the styling appointment this afternoon? Yes. And book the penthouse suite at the Fairmont for tonight. Miss Summers will need somewhere appropriate to prepare for tomorrow's performance. Juliet's head spun. I can't afford... Everything is covered under the contract terms. Thomas's smile was predatory. Consider it an investment in my success, though I suggest you enjoy the luxury while it lasts. In 6 months, you'll be back to your studio apartment and night shift, but at least your brother will be walking. The casual cruelty stole her breath. Even as he gave her everything she needed, Thomas made sure she understood exactly how temporary and undeserved it all was. This wasn't generosity, it was ownership. One more thing, Thomas said as Juliet reached for the pen. The transformation starts now. Hair, makeup, wardrobe, etiquette coaching. You have 18 hours to become someone Isabella might actually believe I could care about. Juliet's hand froze over the signature line. In signing this contract, she wasn't just agreeing to pretend to love Thomas Blackwell. She was agreeing to become someone else entirely, to erase herself so completely that even she might forget who she really was. What happens to me when this is over? She whispered. Thomas leaned forward, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. That depends entirely on how well you play your part, Miss Summers. Disappoint me, and you'll discover just how creative I can be with destruction. The pen felt impossibly heavy in her hand, as Juliet signed her name with a flourish that sealed her fate. The moment the ink dried, Thomas's expression shifted into something that might have passed for satisfaction in a less predatory creature. Welcome to my world, Juliet. Her name on his lips sounded like both a promise and a threat. Try not to drown. Thomas, darling, I see you've brought entertainment for the evening. Isabella Ashworth's voice cut through the elegant chatter of the Fairmont Olympics grand ballroom like a blade wrapped in silk. Juliet felt every eye in the room turn toward them as Isabella glided over, her emerald gown flowing like liquid starlight, diamonds glittering at her throat like captured stars. The woman was even more devastating in person, tall, graceful, with the kind of effortless beauty that made other women disappear. Thomas's hand tightened possessively on Juliet's waist, his fingers burning through the midnight blue Valentino dress the stylists had forced her into. After 18 hours of torture, hair extensions, professional makeup, etiquette coaching, and a wardrobe that cost more than her annual rent, Juliet barely recognized herself in the mirror. But standing next to Isabella, she felt like a child playing dress-up in her mother's clothes. Isabella! Thomas's voice was perfectly controlled, though Juliet felt the tension radiating from his body. You look predictable. Let me introduce Juliet Summers, my girlfriend. The word girlfriend rolled off his tongue with practiced ease, but Juliet caught the slight tremor underneath. This was the woman who'd walked away from Thomas Blackwell, something apparently no one had ever done before. Girlfriend? Isabella's laugh was like crystal chimes, beautiful and sharp enough to draw blood. How refreshing. And what do you do, dear? The question was innocent enough, but Juliet heard the venom underneath. Every instinct screamed at her to run, to tear off this borrowed identity and flee back to her real life of night shifts and medical bills. But Danny's face flashed in her mind, his hopeful smile when she told him about the surgery, the way his eyes had lit up for the first time in months. I'm a teacher, Juliet lied smoothly, the words sliding out with surprising confidence. The etiquette coach had drilled her on this backstory. Elementary education. I work with underprivileged children. How noble. Isabella's green eyes glittered with malicious amusement. Thomas has always had such a soft spot for charity cases. The insult hit like a physical blow, but before Juliet could respond, a distinguished older man appeared at Isabella's side. Richard Ashworth III was everything the photos had promised. Classically handsome with silver threading his temples, wearing his wealth like a comfortable old coat rather than armor. Darling, you must be Thomas. Richard extended his hand with genuine warmth. Isabella's told me so much about you. And this must be the lovely Juliet. The kindness in his voice made Juliet's chest tighten with unexpected guilt. This man had no idea he was standing in the middle of Thomas's twisted game, that his fiancée's ex-lover was planning to steal her back, using Juliet as bait. Richard. Thomas shook his hand with perfect civility, but Juliet saw the calculation in his eyes. Congratulations on your engagement. Though I have to admit, I'm surprised Isabella settled down so quickly after our arrangement ended. The word arrangement hung in the air like poison gas. Isabella's perfect composure cracked for just a moment, and Juliet saw something raw flash across her face. Hurt, anger, or maybe regret. Some of us believe in love, Thomas, Isabella said, her voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Not everything is a business transaction. Of course not, Thomas replied with silky smoothness. Some things are investments, long-term strategies. Patience always pays off in the end. The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Juliet felt sick as she realized she was watching Thomas plant the seeds of doubt in Isabella's mind, using their fake relationship as psychological warfare. This wasn't about love. It was about winning, about proving that no one could walk away from Thomas Blackwell without consequences. If you'll excuse us, Richard said, his arm sliding protectively around Isabella's waist. We should greet our other guests. Enjoy the party. As they moved away, Juliet caught Isabella glancing back over her shoulder, her green eyes locked on Thomas with an expression Juliet couldn't quite read. Longing? Regret? Or something more dangerous? Well done, Thomas murmured against her ear, his breath sending unwanted shivers down her spine. You played that perfectly. I feel sick, Juliet whispered back, her hand gripping his arm for support. The champagne she'd barely touched was making her dizzy, or maybe it was the suffocating weight of the lies she was living. Get used to it. Thomas's voice was merciless. We're just getting started. The next hour passed in a blur of introductions and small talk. Thomas paraded her around the ballroom like a prized acquisition, his hand never leaving her waist, playing the role of devoted boyfriend with Oscar-worthy precision. He laughed at her nervous jokes, whispered sweet nothings that sounded genuine enough to fool everyone, including, disturbingly, herself. But Juliet noticed everything, the way Isabella's eyes followed them across the room, how Richard's smile became more forced each time he caught his fiancée watching Thomas, the whispered conversations that stopped when they approached, the curious stares from Seattle's elite who were clearly trying to figure out what Thomas Blackwell was doing with such an obvious outsider. "You're quite the mystery woman." A silver-haired socialite cornered Juliet near the champagne fountain. "No one can figure out where Thomas found you. You're not from our usual circles, are you, dear?" "No," Juliet said quietly. "I'm not." "How exotic." The woman's smile was sharp as a scalpel. "And how did you two meet? The Thomas we know isn't exactly known for charitable inclinations." Before Juliet could answer, Thomas appeared at her side like a guardian angel, or perhaps a demon in an Armani tuxedo. "Margaret, still collecting gossip like a magpie, I see." His smile was charming and deadly. "Juliet and I prefer to keep our love story private. Some things are too precious to share with the masses." The word love sent an electric shock through Juliet's system. The way he said it, looking directly into her eyes with those devastating blue depths, almost made her believe it herself. For one dangerous moment, she forgot this was all pretend. "Dance with me," Thomas said, not asking but commanding as he led her toward the marble dance floor where other couples swayed to the string quartet's haunting melody. His arms encircled her waist as they began to move, and Juliet was painfully aware of every point where their bodies touched. Thomas was an excellent dancer, of course he was, guiding her effortlessly through steps she'd only seen in movies. Up close, she could see the fine lines around his eyes, smell his expensive cologne mixed with something uniquely him. "She's watching," Thomas murmured, his lips brushing her ear. "Isabella. She hasn't taken her eyes off us since we started dancing." Juliet turned slightly and caught Isabella's gaze from across the room. The supermodel was dancing with Richard, but her attention was entirely focused on Thomas and Juliet. There was something hungry in her expression, something desperate that made Juliet's stomach clench with guilt. "She still loves you," Juliet whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. "Love." Thomas's laugh was bitter. "She loves the idea of me, the challenge, the danger. Richard is safe, predictable, everything she thought she wanted until she saw what she gave up. And what if she doesn't come back? What if she chooses him?" Thomas spun her suddenly, pulling her back against his chest with possessive force. "She will. Women like Isabella always want what they can't have. And right now, she thinks she can't have me." The song ended, but Thomas didn't release her. They stood frozen in the middle of the dance floor, his arms still around her waist, their faces inches apart. For a moment, the ballroom faded away. The glittering crowd, the crystal chandeliers, even Isabella herself. There was only Thomas's intense blue gaze and the dangerous electricity crackling between them. "Thomas." Isabella's voice shattered the spell like breaking glass. They broke apart to find her standing beside them, Richard nowhere to be seen. Up close, Juliet could see the fine tension lines around Isabella's eyes, the way her perfect composure was starting to crack. "I need to speak with you," Isabella continued, her voice carefully controlled. "Privately." "Of course." Thomas's smile was pure predator. "Juliet, darling, why don't you powder your nose? This won't take long." Dismissed like a servant, Juliet walked away on unsteady legs, her heart hammering against her ribs. As she reached the marble pillars at the edge of the ballroom, she couldn't resist looking back. Thomas and Isabella stood close together, their heads bent in intimate conversation. Even from a distance, Juliet could see the tension between them, the magnetic pull that drew them together despite everything. Isabella's hand reached out, almost touching Thomas's cheek before she caught herself and pulled back. Watching them together, Juliet felt something twist painfully in her chest, something that felt dangerously like jealousy, which was insane. This was all pretend. Thomas Blackwell was using her to win back the woman he really loved, and she was nothing more than a pawn in his game. So why did seeing him with Isabella feel like her heart was being ripped from her chest? Having second thoughts? Juliet spun around to find Richard Ashworth behind her, his kind eyes filled with an understanding that made her want to confess everything. "I'm sorry?" she managed. "About getting involved with Thomas Blackwell." Richard's voice was gentle but knowing. "He's not an easy man to love, is he?" The question hung between them like a loaded gun. Juliet stared at this decent man who had no idea his fiancée was falling back under her ex-lover's spell and felt the weight of her deception crushing down on her. "No," she whispered, the truth slipping out before she could stop it. "He's not." "You magnificent little fool. You're actually falling for me, aren't you?" Thomas's words hit Juliet like a physical blow as she stood frozen in the doorway of his penthouse suite. She'd come back from the engagement party in silence, her mind reeling from Richard's knowing questions and the devastating realization that watching Thomas with Isabella had felt like watching her heart being torn from her chest. Now, at 2 a.m, Thomas stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking Elliott Bay, his bow tie undone and his perfect facade finally cracking. "I don't know what you mean," Juliet whispered, though her voice betrayed her. The midnight blue Valentino dress suddenly felt like a costume she was desperate to shed, a reminder of how easily she'd been transformed into someone she didn't recognize. Thomas turned from the window, his blue eyes blazing with something between triumph and disgust. "Don't lie to me, Juliet. I watched you during the party. The way you looked at me during that dance. The way your face changed when you saw me talking to Isabella." His laugh was sharp as breaking glass. "Christ, you actually thought it was real, didn't you?" The cruelty in his voice stripped away her defenses like acid. Juliet's hands trembled as she reached up to remove the diamond earrings he'd insisted she wear. Borrowed jewelry for a borrowed life. "The contract was very clear about this," Thomas continued, stalking toward her like a predator sensing wounded prey. "No genuine emotions, no inconvenient feelings. You were supposed to be smart enough to remember this was all pretend." "I remember," Juliet said, lifting her chin despite the tears threatening to spill. "I remember that you're paying me to be here, that none of this is real, that in 6 months I'll disappear back to my pathetic little life while you get your perfect supermodel back." "Then why?" Thomas grabbed her wrist, his fingers like steel bands. "Did you look like I'd murdered your puppy when Isabella asked to speak with me privately?" The question hung between them like a loaded weapon. Juliet stared up at this beautiful, ruthless man who'd somehow managed to slip past every defense she'd built around her heart, and felt her carefully constructed composure crumble. "Because I'm an idiot," she whispered. "Because somewhere between signing your contract and dancing with you tonight, I forgot that you're incapable of genuine human emotion. I forgot that this is all just a game to you." Thomas released her wrist so abruptly she stumbled backward. "A game?" His voice dropped to a dangerous whisper. "You think this is a game to me?" "Isn't it?" Juliet's anger finally ignited, burning away her fear. "You're playing chess with human hearts, Thomas. You're using me to make Isabella jealous, manipulating her engagement to another man, and treating both of us like we're pieces on your board to be moved around at will. And what would you have me do?" Thomas's mask finally slipped completely, revealing something raw and desperate underneath. "Let her marry that boring aristocrat and pretend I don't exist. Watch her throw away what we had for some fairy tale about love conquering all. Maybe you should let her be happy." The words exploded out of Juliet before she could stop them. Maybe Richard actually loves her for who she is, not as some prize to be won. Maybe she deserves better than being manipulated by a man who thinks emotions are weaknesses to be exploited. The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas stared at her as if she'd slapped him, his face cycling through emotions too quickly to track. When he finally spoke, his voice was deadly quiet. "You don't know what you're talking about, don't I?" Juliet stepped closer, her fear evaporating in the face of righteous fury. "I've watched you tonight, Thomas. I've seen how you operate. You don't love Isabella. You're obsessed with her. You can't stand that she walked away, that she chose someone else, that for once in your life someone said no to the great Thomas Blackwell. Shut up." The words were barely human, torn from somewhere deep in his chest. "You want to know what I think?" Juliet was past caring about consequences now, past caring about contracts or money or even Danny's surgery. I think you're terrified. I think Isabella saw right through you, saw that underneath all that wealth and power, you're just a scared little boy who doesn't know how to love anyone but himself. Thomas moved so fast, she didn't see it coming. One moment she was standing by the window, the next she was pressed against the wall, his hands on either side of her face, his body caging her in. His eyes were wild, desperate, and for the first time since she'd met him, completely unguarded. You want to know about love? His voice was ragged, barely controlled. You want to know what it feels like to need someone so desperately that you destroy everything just to have them back? To lie awake at night, remembering the way they laughed, the way they said your name, the way they made you feel like maybe, just maybe, you weren't the monster everyone said you were. Juliet's breath caught as she saw the truth written across his face. This wasn't about winning or obsession or wounded pride. This was about a man who'd found something real and lost it, who was drowning in his own desperate need to get it back. Thomas, she whispered. And then, he continued, his voice breaking, you hire some nobody to pretend to love you, thinking it'll be simple, thinking you can control every variable. But she looks at you like you might actually be worth saving. And for one fucking moment during that dance, you forget it's all fake. You forget she's just playing a part, and you let yourself believe that maybe someone could love the real you. The confession hung between them like a live wire. Juliet stared up at Thomas, seeing past the cruel mask to the wounded man underneath, and felt her heart shatter for both of them. But it's not fake, she whispered. Not for me. The words escaped before she could stop them, and she watched Thomas's face transform. The desperate vulnerability vanished, replaced by something cold and calculating. Yes, it is. He stepped back as if she'd burned him. It has to be. Thomas, no. His voice was final, absolute. You're a romantic little fool who's confused gratitude with affection. I'm paying you to play a part, nothing more. Don't make this more complicated than it needs to be. The dismissal hit her like a physical blow. Juliet watched as Thomas rebuilt his walls in real time, the vulnerable man disappearing behind layers of ice and steel. But she'd seen the truth now, and she couldn't unsee it. What did Isabella say to you tonight? She asked quietly. Thomas went very still. That's none of your concern. It is, if I'm supposed to convince her you've changed. What did she say, Thomas? For a moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then his shoulders sagged almost imperceptibly, and when he spoke, his voice was hollow. She said she was making a mistake, that Richard is a good man who deserves better than a woman who's still in love with her ex. He looked up, and Juliet saw something like hope flickering in his eyes. She said she thinks about me every day, that she misses what we had. Juliet's heart clenched. And what did you tell her? That she should follow her heart. Thomas's smile was bitter. That life's too short to settle for safe when you could have everything. You told her to leave Richard. I told her to choose wisely. Thomas moved to the bar, pouring himself 3 fingers of whiskey with hands that weren't quite steady. The wedding is in 2 weeks. She has time to think. And if she chooses you, then our arrangement ends early, and you get your money. He downed the whiskey in one swallow. If she chooses him, we continue the charade until she changes her mind. And if she never changes her mind, Juliet asked softly. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, staring out at the city lights reflecting on the dark water. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely audible. Then I'll have to accept that some things can't be bought, manipulated, or won. The admission cost him something. She could see it in the way his shoulders tensed, the way his hands gripped the glass. For all his arrogance and cruelty, Thomas Blackwell was just a man terrified of losing the only person who'd ever made him feel human. Thomas, Juliet said carefully, what if Isabella isn't the person you're really in love with? He turned sharply, his eyes narrowing. What the hell is that supposed to mean? What if you're holding on to her because she represents something you've never had? What if you're so focused on winning her back that you can't see what's right in front of you? And what exactly is in front of me? His voice was dangerous, warning her to back down. But Juliet had already crossed too many lines tonight to stop now. Someone who sees past your money and your manipulation. Someone who looks at you and sees the man you could be, not the man you think you have to be. Someone who's falling in love with you despite every reason not to. The silence stretched between them like a chasm. Thomas stared at her with an expression she couldn't read, his blue eyes searching her face as if looking for lies. "You're fired," he said finally. The words hit her like ice water. "What?" "The contract is void. Pack your things and get out." His voice was perfectly controlled again. The vulnerable man locked away. "I'll have the money transferred to your account in the morning. Payment for services rendered." Juliet felt the bottom drop out of her world. "Thomas, you can't." "I can do whatever I want. This is my game, my rules." He turned back to the window, dismissing her. "You've forgotten your place, Miss Summers. This arrangement works because you're nobody special. The moment you start believing otherwise, you become useless to me." The cruelty was surgical, precise, designed to cut as deep as possible. Juliet stood there for a moment, feeling the weight of his rejection crushing down on her, before she found her voice. "You're right," she said quietly. "I did forget my place. I forgot that you're exactly the kind of man who would destroy something beautiful just because you're too afraid to let it exist." She walked toward the door, her head held high despite the tears streaming down her face. At the threshold, she turned back one last time. "I hope Isabella chooses Richard," she said. "Not because she doesn't love you, but because she deserves someone brave enough to love her back." The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving Thomas alone with his whiskey and the sound of his own breathing. In the reflection of the window, he could see himself, successful, powerful, and completely alone. Just the way he'd always been, just the way he'd chosen to stay. She was right about everything, wasn't she? You really are just a scared little boy playing with people's hearts. Thomas looked up from his whiskey glass to find Isabella standing in his penthouse living room, her red hair catching the morning light streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. She looked ethereal in her white silk dress, like an angel come to deliver judgment, or perhaps to offer salvation. It had been 5 days since Juliet walked out of his life. 5 days of sleepless nights, ignored phone calls, and a level of misery that no amount of alcohol could numb. His empire continued to function. Meetings attended, deals closed, profits generated. But Thomas felt like he was watching his life through bulletproof glass, disconnected from everything that had once mattered. "Isabella." His voice was rougher than he'd intended. "How did you get in here? Your doorman still remembers me." She moved closer, her heels clicking against the marble floor. "I told him I was here to save you from yourself. He seemed to think that was a worthy cause." Thomas set down his glass with carefully controlled precision. Even disheveled and broken, he wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing him completely destroyed. "Shouldn't you be planning your wedding? I hear Richard spared no expense for Seattle's social event of the season." "The wedding's off." Isabella's words hit him like a physical blow, though her expression remained unreadable. "I called it off 3 days ago." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. Thomas gripped the edge of his desk, afraid his legs might give out beneath him. This was what he'd wanted, what he'd orchestrated with such careful manipulation. So why did he feel like he was drowning? "Isabella." "Don't." She held up one perfectly manicured hand. "Don't say whatever calculating thing you're about to say. For once in your life, Thomas, just listen." He fell silent, watching as she moved to the windows that overlooked Elliott Bay. In the distance, ferries crossed the dark water like toys, carrying people to lives he'd never understand. Simple lives filled with ordinary love and uncomplicated happiness. "I left Richard because you were right," Isabella said quietly. "I was settling, choosing safety over passion, comfort over the kind of love that sets your soul on fire. She turned to face him, and Thomas saw tears glittering in her green eyes. "But I didn't leave him for you." The words hit him harder than any physical blow. "What?" "I left him because your little charade with Juliet showed me something I'd never seen before." Isabella's voice was steady, but he could hear the pain underneath. "I saw you look at that girl the way you never once looked at me. I saw you dance with her like she was made of spun glass and starlight. And I realized that what we had, what I thought was love, was just two beautiful broken people trying to fill the emptiness inside each other." Thomas felt the world shifting beneath his feet. "Isabella, it's not real?" Isabella laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Oh, Thomas, it's the most real thing I've ever seen you feel. The way you touched her, protected her, the way your whole face changed when she smiled. That wasn't an act. That was a man falling in love for the first time in his life." "She was playing a part," Thomas said desperately, clinging to the lie even as it crumbled around him. "She was paid to what? To look at you like you hung the moon. To defend you against people who questioned your motives. To see past your money and your manipulation to the man underneath." Isabella shook her head. "You can't pay someone to love you the way that girl loves you, Thomas. Believe me, I should know." The admission hung between them like a confession. Thomas stared at this woman he'd thought he loved, this beautiful creature he'd been so desperate to reclaim, and felt something fundamental shift inside his chest. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked quietly. "Because someone needs to." Isabella moved closer, her expression gentle in a way he'd never seen before. "Because you're about to make the biggest mistake of your life, and for once, I want to see you choose happiness over control." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do." Isabella reached out, touching his cheek with the same gesture she'd almost made at the engagement party. "You fired her because she told you the truth, because she saw through your defenses and made you feel something real, and that terrified you more than losing your fortune ever could." Thomas closed his eyes, feeling the weight of her words settling over him like a shroud. In the darkness behind his eyelids, he could see Juliet's face, the way she'd looked during their dance, the fire in her eyes when she'd confronted him, the devastation when he'd dismissed her like she meant nothing. "She's better off without me," he said quietly. "I'm exactly what she said, a monster who destroys everything beautiful." "No." Isabella's voice was firm. "You're a man who's never learned how to love without trying to own. But she's teaching you, isn't she? She's showing you what it feels like to put someone else's happiness before your own need to win. It doesn't matter." Thomas opened his eyes, meeting Isabella's gaze. "It's too late. I destroyed whatever we had. I made sure of that. It's only too late if you let it be." Isabella stepped back, her hand falling to her side. "Do you know what I'm going to do now? I'm going to travel. See the world without worrying about photo ops or publicity. Maybe I'll find someone who loves me for who I am, not who I appear to be in magazines." "Isabella, and you," she continued, moving toward the door, "are going to stop being a coward. You're going to go to that girl and tell her the truth, that you love her, that you're sorry, that you want to spend the rest of your life proving you're worthy of the heart she gave you." "What if she won't forgive me?" Isabella paused at the door, turning back with a smile that was both sad and hopeful. "Then you'll have to earn it. And Thomas, for the first time in your life, you'll be fighting for something that actually matters." The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving Thomas alone with the echo of her words and the devastating realization that everything he'd thought he wanted had been wrong. He pulled out his phone, scrolling to Juliet's number, his thumb hovering over the call button. But what could he say? How could he possibly explain that he'd been running from the one thing he'd been searching for his entire life? Instead, he found himself calling his assistant. "Harrison, I need you to find out everything about Juliet Summers' current situation. Where she's living, how her brother's surgery went, what she's doing for work. Everything." "Sir, didn't you terminate the arrangement with Miss Summers?" I did. Thomas closed his eyes, feeling the full weight of his mistake. And now I need to figure out how to undo the most catastrophic error of my life. The next 3 hours passed in a blur of phone calls and research. Harrison was nothing if not thorough. Within hours, Thomas had a complete picture of Juliet's life since she'd walked out of his penthouse. The news was both better and worse than he'd feared. Danny's surgery had been successful. The boy was already walking with assistance, his prognosis excellent. Juliet had used part of the money to move them into a small but decent apartment near the hospital, close enough for Danny's physical therapy appointments. But she'd also done something that made Thomas's chest tighten with an emotion he couldn't name. She'd donated half the money to a fund for other families facing similar medical crises. Even after everything he'd put her through, even after he'd treated her like she was nothing, Juliet had used his money to help others. "Sir?" Harrison's voice broke through his thoughts. "There's something else. Miss Summers has taken a position at Evergreen Elementary. She starts teaching 3rd grade next week." Teaching. She was finally pursuing the dream she'd buried to take care of her brother. Thomas felt something like pride mix with the ache in his chest. Even without him, even after everything, Juliet was building the life she'd always wanted. "And sir, I took the liberty of checking her references for the position. Apparently, she listed her volunteer work with underprivileged children as experience." Harrison paused meaningfully. "The work she's been doing every weekend for the past 3 years, even while working 3 jobs to support her family." Thomas felt his world tilt again. The story she'd told Isabella at the engagement party about working with underprivileged children hadn't been a lie. It had been the truth, the one part of herself she'd refused to give up, even when everything else was falling apart. "Harrison, clear my schedule for the rest of the week." "Sir? I'm going to fix this." Thomas was already moving toward his closet, shedding his suit jacket. "And if I'm very lucky, I might just save my soul in the process." "Where should I tell people you've gone?" Thomas paused, thinking of Juliet's fire, her courage, the way she'd looked at him like he might actually be worth saving. "Tell them I've gone to learn the difference between winning and earning," he said. "And Harrison, if this works, remind me to give you a raise. If it doesn't..." He trailed off, the possibility of failure too devastating to contemplate. "It will work, sir," Harrison said quietly. "Love usually does when it's real." Thomas ended the call and stared at himself in the mirror, powerful, wealthy, successful, and completely alone. In 48 hours, it would be Isabella's original wedding date. The whole city would be talking about the canceled ceremony, the gossip mills working overtime to figure out what had happened. But Thomas had a different kind of ceremony to prepare for. One where he laid down his armor and offered his heart to the woman brave enough to see past his defenses to the man he could become. The only question was whether Juliet would give him the chance to prove he was finally ready to love her the way she deserved. "Miss Summers, there's a man outside your classroom who says he needs to apologize for being the biggest fool in Seattle. Should I call security or fetch a priest?" Juliet looked up from the reading circle where 8-year-old Marcus was struggling through a picture book about dragons and friendship. Her 3rd grade classroom at Evergreen Elementary was her sanctuary, bright with student artwork, smelling of markers and hope, filled with the kind of uncomplicated love she'd thought existed only in fairy tales. Mrs. Henderson, the school secretary, stood in the doorway with barely concealed amusement. Behind her, through the small window in the classroom door, Juliet caught a glimpse of an expensive suit and familiar dark hair. Her heart stopped. "Tell him the school doesn't allow solicitors," Juliet managed, though her voice shook slightly. "Honey, this man just wrote a check to fund our entire arts program for the next 5 years. Mrs. Henderson's eyes sparkled with mischief. "I think we can spare a few minutes to hear what he has to say." "Miss Summers." Little Emma tugged on her sleeve. "Why do you look scared? Is the dragon man here?" Juliet forced a smile, looking down at her students. 22 beautiful faces filled with curiosity and trust. These children had become her world in the past 2 weeks, their innocent questions and fierce hugs healing wounds she hadn't even known existed. "Sometimes grown-ups need to have difficult conversations," she said gently. "Just like when you need to apologize to someone you've hurt." "But you never hurt nobody, Miss Summers," Marcus said loyally. "You're the nicest teacher ever." The simple faith in his voice nearly broke her heart. Through the window, she could see Thomas pacing in the hallway like a caged panther, his usual composure nowhere to be found. What could possibly have brought him here, to her new life, her safe haven? "Mrs. Henderson, could you take the children to the library for story time? I'll speak with him." 10 minutes later, Juliet stood alone in her classroom as Thomas Blackwell stepped through the doorway. He looked different. His perfect hair was disheveled, his usually immaculate suit wrinkled as if he'd slept in it. But it was his eyes that stopped her breath. Gone was the cold calculation she remembered, replaced by something raw and desperate and utterly vulnerable. "Hello, Juliet." His voice was barely above a whisper, as if he was afraid speaking too loudly might shatter whatever fragile chance he had. Juliet crossed her arms over her chest, armor against the way her heart wanted to leap at the sight of him. "Mr. Blackwell." The formality was deliberate, a reminder of the distance between them. "You shouldn't be here." "I know." Thomas stepped further into the room, looking oddly out of place among the tiny desks and cheerful posters. "I know I have no right to be here, no right to ask for your time or your attention. But I needed to tell you something, and I couldn't trust it to a phone call or a letter. What could you possibly have to say to me?" Thomas looked around the classroom. At the reading corner with its overstuffed pillows, the wall covered in student essays about their heroes, the small garden growing in mason jars on the windowsill. "You did it," he said quietly. "You became exactly who you were meant to be. No thanks to you." The words came out sharper than she'd intended, but Juliet couldn't bring herself to regret them. "No," Thomas agreed, "in spite of me. Which makes what I have to tell you even more important." He took a deep breath, and Juliet saw his hands tremble slightly. "Isabella called off her wedding." Juliet's heart lurched, though she tried to keep her expression neutral. "Congratulations. You got what you wanted." "Did I?" Thomas's laugh was bitter. "She called it off because she realized something I was too blind to see. She said she couldn't marry Richard while she knew what real love looked like." "I'm happy for you both," Juliet said, though the words tasted like ash. "Now, if you'll excuse me, I have a class to prepare for." She moved toward her desk, but Thomas's voice stopped her cold. "She didn't leave him for me, Juliet. She left him because she saw the way I looked at you." Juliet's hand froze on her lesson plans. Slowly, she turned to face him, searching his expression for the lie, the manipulation, the cruel game she was sure was coming. "What?" "Isabella told me that what we had wasn't love. It was just two broken people trying to fill empty spaces inside each other." Thomas's voice was raw, stripped of all his usual polish. "She said she saw me fall in love for the first time in my life, and she couldn't pretend anymore that what we had was real." "Thomas, don't." Juliet backed away, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Don't you dare use her to manipulate me again. I won't. I love you." The three words hung in the air between them like a bridge across an impossible chasm. Thomas stood perfectly still, his blue eyes locked on hers, as if his entire world balanced on her reaction. "I love you," he repeated, his voice stronger now. "Not because you played your part well, not because you served some purpose in my grand plan. I love you because you looked at me, really looked at me, and still chose to see something worth saving. I love you because you gave half my money away to help strangers. I love you because you fight for children who have no one else to fight for them. I love you because you're brave enough to tell the truth even when it hurts." Tears burned behind Juliet's eyes, but she forced herself to stay strong. "You fired me. You told me I meant nothing to you. I was terrified." Thomas stepped closer, and Juliet could see the pain etched in every line of his face. I've spent my entire life believing that love was just another form of weakness, another way for people to control and manipulate each other. When I realized what I felt for you was real, I panicked. I destroyed it before it could destroy me. And now? Juliet's voice was barely a whisper. Now I know that loving you isn't weakness. It's the first brave thing I've ever done. Thomas reached into his jacket, pulling out a thick envelope. This is my resignation from Blackwell Enterprises. I'm selling the company, liquidating my assets. I'm starting over. Juliet stared at the papers in shock. Thomas, you can't. I can, and I will. Because you were right about everything. I used my wealth as a weapon, my power as a shield. I turned love into a game because I was too afraid to risk losing. He set the envelope on her desk with hands that shook slightly. I'm not asking you to take me back. I'm not asking you to forgive me. I'm just asking for the chance to prove that I can be the man you believed I could become. The classroom fell silent except for the distant sound of children's laughter drifting in from the hallway. Juliet stared at this powerful man who was offering to give up everything he'd built, everything he was, for the chance to earn her love. What about your empire? Your legacy? What legacy? Thomas's smile was sad but genuine. A bunch of buildings with my name on them? Money that will be forgotten the moment I'm gone? You said once that I was a scared little boy playing with people's hearts. You were right. But you also saw something else in me. Something I'd forgotten existed. Thomas, I'm not asking for an answer now, he said quickly. I know I have to earn your trust back. I know I have to prove that I can love you without trying to own you, that I can put your happiness before my need to control every outcome. He moved toward the door, then paused. But I needed you to know that you were right. About everything. About me. About what love should be. About the man I could become if I'm brave enough to try. He was almost to the hallway when Juliet's voice stopped him. Thomas, wait. He turned, and she saw a naked hope flicker across his face before he quickly concealed it. Danny wants to meet you, she said quietly. He's been asking questions about the man who paid for his surgery. I told him you were complicated. And what did you tell him about us? Juliet took a shaky breath, feeling the walls around her heart beginning to crack. I told him that sometimes good people make terrible mistakes, and sometimes terrible people do good things. I told him that love isn't always enough, but it's always worth fighting for. Thomas's eyes never left her face. And what do you believe? I believe, Juliet said carefully, that you broke my heart because you were afraid of how much you loved me. And I believe that you're here now because you're finally ready to be brave. Does that mean... It means... Juliet stepped closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in his blue eyes. That you have work to do. Real work. Not buying your way into my good graces or manipulating situations to get what you want. If you want my love, Thomas Blackwell, you're going to have to earn it one day at a time. The smile that spread across Thomas's face was like sunrise after the longest night. I can do that. I want to do that. It won't be easy, Juliet warned. I'm not the same girl you hired to play pretend. I know my worth now. I know what I deserve. You deserve everything, Thomas said simply. And I'm going to spend the rest of my life trying to be worthy of giving it to you. Through the window, Juliet could see her students returning from the library, their faces bright with excitement and stories. In an hour, she'd go home to Danny, who was walking again thanks to the man standing before her. Tomorrow, she'd wake up in her own apartment, living her own dreams, free to choose her own path. And maybe, just maybe, that path would include teaching a former billionaire how to love without conditions, how to build something real instead of just acquiring what already existed. There's one more thing, Thomas said, pulling a small velvet box from his pocket. Before you say anything, this isn't a proposal, it's a promise. He opened the box to reveal not an engagement ring, but a simple silver band set with her grandmother's tiny diamond, the one she'd sold months ago to pay for Danny's medications. "How did you—" Juliet's voice broke as tears spilled down her cheeks. "I bought it back the day after you walked out of my life. I've been carrying it ever since, waiting for the chance to return it to you." Thomas held out the box, but didn't try to take her hand. "It belongs with you, just like my heart. No strings, no contracts, no conditions. Just a promise that someday, if I earn the right, I'd like to give you a ring that means something." Juliet stared at the ring that represented everything she'd sacrificed, everything she'd lost, everything she'd thought was gone forever. And in that moment, she understood that Thomas Blackwell had already begun the work of earning her love. "Ask me again in 6 months," she said softly, taking the ring and sliding it onto her right hand where it belonged. "Ask me when you've learned the difference between loving someone and needing to possess them. And if I do, if I become the man you deserve?" Juliet smiled through her tears, seeing not the ruthless billionaire who'd tried to buy her heart, but the vulnerable man who was finally ready to offer his own. "Then maybe you'll discover that the best things in life aren't acquired or won," she said. "They're given freely by people who choose to love you despite your flaws, not because of your assets." "I love you, Juliet Summers," Thomas said again, and this time the words sounded like a prayer. "I know," she replied. "Now prove it." As her students burst through the classroom door, filling the space with noise and chaos and unconditional joy, Juliet watched Thomas step back into the hallway. But this time, she knew he wasn't walking away. He was walking toward the life they might build together. A life based not on contracts and manipulation, but on the simple, revolutionary act of two people choosing to love each other enough to become their best selves. The dragon in Marcus's storybook had been tamed by kindness, not conquest. And maybe, just maybe, the same magic could work in real life too. After all, every fairy tale needed a little believing to come true.